Hello and welcome to Globe Watch from the Cameroon Radio Television with me, Charles Ebune, from the Ghanaian capital, Accra. And the building behind me is one of the most important ones here in the Ghanaian capital. It is the seat of the country's parliament. And just in front of me is the Ghana International or Accra International Conference Center, where the 30th General Assembly meetings of the Afri-Exim Bank took place. Amongst the attendees were world leaders like former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo. One key element of the African market today is the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, with a common market space of roughly 55 countries, creating a common market of roughly 1.5 billion people and an annual GDP of roughly $3 trillion. Just what are the impressions of key partners in the realization of this dream? My guest today on Globe Watch is one of the key partners who worked behind the scenes in the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The former Executive Secretary and UN Under-Secretary General of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, today a professor of public policy at the Nelson Mandela Institute, lodged at the Cape Town University in South Africa, Carlos Lopes. Carlos Lopes, welcome to Globe Watch.
Thank you.
The last time I had you was about 8 years ago. I'm glad to receive you here in Accra, Ghana.
Thank you. It is a pleasure for me too.
When you look at the African economic environment today in 2023, 30 years of the Afri-Exim Bank, 60 years of the African Unity, plus the operational mechanism being worked out for the effective African Continental Free Trade Area, how do you qualify the African economic environment today?
Well, I would say that from the 91 Abuja Treaty, the level of ambition was established in terms of economic integration of the continent. And the idea then was that we would go into different steps. One was to make sure that the regional economic blocs were going to exercise themselves the opportunity of free trading, and then we'll build those blocks into a continental-wide proposal. And this didn't work well until 2012. There was very little progress. And the reason was mostly that this building blocks approach was not the most appropriate. You always have countries that are very slow in moving. And if you go by the least common denominator, you are kind of trapped by the ones that don't want to move. And instead, the whole system was turned in its head. And instead of just questioning the ambition of the Abuja Treaty, there was a process of putting together a new agenda, Agenda 2063, that basically calls for an acceleration of a certain number of projects that have become flagship projects for the continent. And one of them, not just one of them, the most important of them, is the Continental Free Trade Area. So you saw a lot of progress from 2012 to 2017. There were 10 ministerial trade meetings, and the result was the establishment of the African CFTA by 2017. Then it was the issue of actually having the number of ratifications that would allow the entry into force of the agreement, which was obtained and eventually launched during a pandemic. So that demonstrates quite a strong political will, and demonstrates also the wish for us to accelerate a bit the timeline for this type of integration once the decision has been taken to go in a different methodology than just building blocks.
So how much of the African Continental Free Trade Area?
It's a big deal. It's a big deal in three aspects in particular. One is the fact that most of what we trade between us African countries is manufacturing and services. So it's a more sophisticated part of our economies. What we trade abroad, outside the continent, is mostly commodities. So it's no surprise that normally countries' fortunes in Africa are defined in terms of how rich they are in natural resources and how rich they are in a particular commodity. And we have suffered from this type of stigma and perception for a very long time. The real richness of the African economies is not that. It's the possibilities of transforming. And if you don't transform your commodities, you basically don't have value addition. You are exporting jobs. And the continental free trade area is going to create the opportunities for us to move in the right direction with structural transformation. The second reason it's so important is because we are at a time where the rules of trade are changing. And these rules are going to become much more dependent on environmental concerns and security concerns. And because of these two new sort of takes on the way we look into the trade system, we are going to value much more certain types of trade that Africa really can place itself ahead of the rest. Why? Because we can diminish emissions by curtailing the need for most of the transformation to take place quite far from where the commodities are, meaning that you have logistics and shipping that are going to contribute to emissions, creating opportunities to do it with a latecomer in industrialization, which Africa is, no doubt, but a latecomer has advantage of moving and leapfrogging directly into green industrialization, and therefore having less emissions, but also using much more cleaner energy matrix. And then the third reason why it is a big deal is because it influences the rest of the economy. It's going to place Africa as a force to reckon with in international negotiations. You don't negotiate in a fragmented, atomized way with the same weight as if it is a continent, with the size and the volumes that Africa will represent. That's why already this year, Africa is going to enter the G20 as Africa, not as a country. And this is an indication that there is a recognition that now, because of the continental free trade area, we can negotiate as one.
Let me just pick one of the issues you talked about when it comes to the fullest implementation of the African continental free trade area, the climate equation, which you mentioned. How much of a hindrance is it going to be if we don't check on it carefully in establishing the necessary mechanisms for trade?
Well, we have examples of the recent acceleration of industrialization being very much low carbon. You have the examples in Ethiopia, their industrial parks being low carbon. You have the examples of a country like Gabon that has now become the second largest wood processor in the world thanks to accelerated industrialization. The industrial park of Nkok in Gabon is the first that has the highest green certification.
The special economic zone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then you have countries like Togo, you have countries like, the southeast of Nigeria, you have countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Namibia, and others that are really having a very clean green matrix in their industrialization policies. So that's very good news. But what is really exciting is the fact that we are moving into a much more rigorous interpretation of what certification of green standards are. I was part of a commission established by the Secretary General of the UN against greenwashing and for certification by non-state entities of their zero carbon claims. And what we can say safely is that it's not possible for the world to move in that direction without using particularly one type of energy, which is green hydrogen. And according to the International Energy Agency, Africa has 60% of the potential for the production of green hydrogen. So which means that we are part of the solution if the world really is serious about zero carbon. And that in a certain way is going to influence the investments, and the investments will become more attractive if we have a continental free trade area where we can have cross-border transactions that were more difficult before.
Let's come back to the African trade area and look at people who made this work where we are today. 44 African countries signed this out in 2018 in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. As we speak, 48 African countries have submitted their documents of ratification at the African Union Commission headquarters in Addis. When you were at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, what was the role the institution playing at the time to help governments shape towards the AFCFTA?
Well, I don't think it will be hazardous for me to say that we played a very important technical role. We were the custodians of most of the work on continental free trade area for a quite a long time. Now it's everybody's business. But at the time, it was ECA that was at the forefront of producing all the technical work. There was a lot of resistance on the part of institutions such as the Bretton Woods institutions. There was a bit of...
that is the IMF and the World Bank.
Yes, but now they are absolutely in favor. I remember, the US government wrote a letter to all heads of state asking them to be careful and refrain from signing the continental free trade area because they felt that it was going to be in contradiction with WTO rules. We were the ones who did the studies to demonstrate that was not the case. We also prepared for certain governments studies that allow them to be a bit more friendlier to the negotiations because they had a bit of hesitation. A case in point, Nigeria, that was not very convinced it was good for the country. So it was a study by ECA that eventually unlocked that sort of hesitation. So there were a number of very important studies done, also in industrialization, that were pointing into the reasoning of free trade in the continent as the key for industrialization acceleration. So no less than 7 major reports were produced under my watch on industrialization. And now it has become absolutely common sense that everybody defends industrialization in the continent as the way to go.
One of the problems the African continental free trade area will be solving is to increase production on the continent, because a majority of goods, especially finished in the petrochemical sector, in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, are being imported, costing billions and billions of dollars each year. How would this help restructure the African production capacity? Especially, let's take the domain of food security.
Well, we said very clearly in the studies that we made then, and that continue to be valid, that there are different types of integration that are needed apart from trade to make trade work. Trade is not isolated. So you need actually to have free circulation of people. It's a very important aspect. So we need to move in that direction, and a number of protocols that have been signed on free circulation of people in the continent that are not being implemented. Then we said that there is a need for integrated infrastructure. So you cannot really have a very good road that stops at a border. It has to continue across the border. The same with the railways, the same with digital connectivity. You need to have ports that don't think just in terms of the country, but also the landlocked neighbors. So this infrastructure integration is extremely important to make smooth operations. The success of Europe or Southeast Asia in terms of integration is good logistics. Then you have a third type of integration, which is macroeconomic convergence. If you don't have macroeconomic convergence, you have difficulties, for instance, in dealing with the currency aspects. You have due diligence that the banks have to put in place that become much more difficult because the regulatory systems will depend very much on how the countries see their macroeconomic policy. So we have to have a very high degree of convergence. Like, for instance, we cannot have, as your neighbor, a country that has huge deficits, levels of inflation that are prohibitive, because that is going to refrain trade. And finally, the last but most important aspect also is that you need to have integration of production. The productive capacities have to be integrated, and that is basically about value chains. You can think of value chains that can be national, but those who work best are the ones that are regional. So we have to, try to build them. And it's not a surprise that in Southeast Asia you have a lot of investments from Japan that have propelled the industrialization of countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. Then when China rose to become the largest economy in the region, they did the same with Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and other countries that are actually part of their value chains. And we need the same champions in Africa to be behind some of these integrated production systems.
One but last question. According to some studies done, in the next decade plus, the African Continental Free Trade Area will lift roughly 100 million people in Africa out of poverty. That's quite significant. You would teach today in a university like Cape Town in South Africa, with an institution attached to the historic Africa's best known political figure, Nelson Mandela. What do you teach them? That these are the kind of things we need to avoid for this to work?
Well, my main teaching is about how we can go for a different model than the one we have right now, that is trapped in the colonial mentality of commodity dependence. And for that, you need structural transformation. Structural transformation is moving the activities as much as possible from low productivity to high productivity. And the best way to do it is through industrialization. But when you go through this sort of technical demonstration of how it is done, how it has worked in other parts of the world, how the latecomers have to copy some things but have to innovate on others, people normally, my students ask, what kind of leadership do we need for this to happen? And it is a leadership that has to have ambition. It's a leadership that has to have the capacity to prioritize. And it is a leadership that needs to actually, when the focus is determined, to have the necessary alignment, coordination for things to happen. A sort of results-based management approach implemented at the leadership level. And of course, the best inspiration is for all of this to be done in a way that is convincing, that is mobilizing, and it is ethical.
Okay.
And it's like you are describing the characteristics of Nelson Mandela.
Finally, you and I are here in Accra, Ghana for the 30th anniversary and annual meetings of the Afro-Exim Bank. How will you qualify their role in the construction of a developed Africa?
They have been amazingly innovative. They have become the bank to go when it comes to innovative ways of dealing with all the difficulties that the African countries have on the financial sector. When there is no money available by other players, Afro-Exim Bank steps in. When there is difficulties with volatility of currencies, they create a payment system that bypasses third parties. When there is difficulty in dealing with the promotion of mega projects, you immediately think of them. When you need to finance or give guarantees to be able to negotiate special arrangements such as the one we needed for the vaccines, they step in. So they are always there for the innovative ways of doing business.
Okay.
So I really praise them for excellent last decade, where they have grown exponentially, and I hope they will continue in the same trajectory.
With that, we conclude the interview. Professor Carlos Lopes, former Executive Secretary, UN Under Secretary General of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, now professor at the Nelson Mandela Institute in the Cape Town University in South Africa. Thank you very much indeed. And it was a pleasure seeing you again after roughly a decade.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. The outgoing British High Commissioner to Cameroon, Dr. Christian Dennis McClure, thank you very much for accepting to talk to us in a more natural environment, which is quite far from the normal offices that you and I usually meet in Yaoundé.
Absolutely, but it's a good opportunity to remind ourselves of the wonderful natural bounty and riches here in Cameroon.
Cameroon counts roughly 900 birds. That is just one of the elements of the flora and fauna of the country. As you have been here for roughly 2 years, 2 months now, what have you discovered in terms of the natural richness of the country?
Well, on the various trips that I've been fortunate enough to take around Cameroon, I've had an opportunity often to go and visit national parks or to see the wonderful nature and fauna that is here in Cameroon. And it's a really good example of the way in which man and the wildlife can live side by side. There are obviously tensions in that relationship. But I think it's important both for us as a High Commission here in Cameroon, but also from the perspective of the UK government, to make sure that we, in our own actions, are also protecting the environment as well as supporting Cameroon to do the same.
We are in Mefu, which is about 12 animal species, about 300 of them here. How central is this Mefu Park to the activities of the British High Commission here in Yaoundé, Cameroon, in terms of environmental protection, especially nature?
So we have a long-standing relationship with Ape Action Africa, who are a British NGO who've been working here for over 25 years. They have done an amazing job to protect and rehabilitate animals who've been saved from trafficking. They are part of a wider ecosystem of organizations that try and protect animals and fauna here in Cameroon. That effort is a part of a much wider set of activities. We support organizations such as Ape Action Africa with our lobbying, with visits like this to try and raise awareness about the importance of the work they do. But we also do a lot of work with the government to try and raise the profile of the need to protect biodiversity. At COP26, the Prime Minister announced a new program for biodiversity protection, which will start being implemented here in Cameroon later this year. And those discussions have been a growing feature of the work of the British High Commission. We recognise, however, that it's not just about us asking people to do things differently, it's also about us doing things differently ourselves. And we've spent a long time during my time here rehabilitating our own estate, our own offices and our own residences, changing the way in which we use land and water by planting more trees and more plants. And even in our own houses we've seen, and offices, we've seen the return of animals and birds who've been a real benefit to not just being a good thing to do because it's important for the animals, but also has helped improve the working environment for our staff.
Well, just at the extreme end there, we can get some kings and or queens of the forest, or chimpanzees, gorillas, and whatsoever you can imagine. How much of nature do you love, particularly you as an individual?
For me, I think the protection of and the importance of the great apes is really significant, and also forest elephants. And they are important because as apex animals that are at the top of the food chain, they are key indicators of the health of a forest. You
mentioned a while ago one of the key events which marked your stay in Cameroon when the UK was hosting COP26. There was much of talking about protecting the environment, about fighting climate change, about mobilizing resources globally to fund the global south. How much of that has been implemented in Cameroon through the various government agencies dealing directly with environmental issues, the Ministry of Forestry and Wildlife and the Ministry of the Environment and Nature Protection, with young game changers, where you had a clean the streets
Clean
campaign show during World Environment Day, or if you like Earth Day this year.
So as I said before, it's a combination of the government investment and work with partners across the sub-region, actually, not just in Cameroon, as well as the actions of the High Commission. So on the wider government support for environmental protection, I already mentioned the Biodiversity Landscape Fund, which will start operating here in Cameroon, Gabon and the Republic of Congo this year. But we have already provided funds for the Central African Forest Initiative, and we made the first UK contributions to that fund just after COP26, and we made a second a second contribution to the fund last financial year. So we've contributed over 11 million pounds sterling already to that initiative, along with lots of other donors. And that program,
that should be roughly 8 billion CFA francs.
Across, so that is a fund that works across the sub-region. Some of those activities will be in Cameroon, some in Gabon and Republic of Congo and elsewhere. And so that marks a real change from an increase in emphasis and focus from the UK government on climate compared to the previous decade.